There we go.
Okay, well, I have great pleasure in introducing you all to Rob Sands. He's a lecturer, assistant professor in the School of Archaeology at University College Dublin, where he's currently deputy head of school. He's had a very varied career teaching experimental archaeology, the digital sort of technological side and survey. But I think it would be fair to say that the thread throughout his career has been his passion for all things wood. And we first connected in the early 90s, so a long time ago, over our involvement with cranogs. Rob was doing his PhD on the woodworking evidence, the tool mark signatures on a cranog in Oakbank. And since then, he's worked on several other aspects of other cranogs, Couleur de Mine in Ireland and Dumbuck as well. And the other strand that he's involved in is the looking at assemblages of wooden artifacts. So the two of us have worked together on the assemblages from Picts now. And I'm very envious of what he's doing at the moment. He's looking at the Roman artifacts from Vindolanda, which is really exciting. But that brings me to the subject that he's talking about tonight, the Fergus Estuary, which, as you can see from his background, is a very woody site. And I was involved on a sort of the side of it, but visited the site with him. And I'm very, very excited to hear what he's going to say tonight. So over to you, Rob.
Perfect. Thanks, Anne. Let's share the screen. So I hope everybody can see the screen there. Give a thumbs up, Doug. Yep, perfect. Thanks a million. Okay. So, good evening, everybody. When I was asked to present something for the group, I thought this case study, although not current, might provoke some relevant discussion. Over a few seasons between 2009 and 2013, I was involved with a project initiated by Professor Aidan O'Sullivan here at UCD, exploring medieval fish weirs on the Fergus Estuary in County Clare, Ireland. And I thought these structures in particular might be valuable things to think with because they're hard to visit, constantly under threat, and are not preservable, I suppose, in any meaningful sense. So let's start by situating you geographically. The Fergus Estuary is located on the west coast of Ireland in County Clare and merges into the larger Shannon Estuary to the south. To the east is the city of Limerick, and to the north, the town of Ennis. Clare Castle is where we catch the boats that take us down to the site on the estuary. And note also that Shannon Airport and its flight paths are nearby, and that may be relevant a little later. The thing about intertidal and estuarine zones is that if you look, you'll nearly always find things, often across a wide date range and with organic survival, which can be exceptionally good. So between 1992 and 1997, Aidan was exploring the Shannon Estuary and discovered Neolithic and late Bronze Age trackways, things like early Christian fish weirs and post-medieval quays, weirs and landing places. This was published by Aidan in 2001 as Foragers, Farmers and Fishers in a Coastal Landscape, a really beautifully produced book and a good read if you get the chance. The first targeted archaeological surveys of the Fergus were initiated by Aidan again and coordinated and run by Mary Dillon, funded by the Heritage Council here in Ireland. The purpose of these was to establish a solid understanding of what might be present. So this involved at this stage rapid reconnaissance from the water, general positioning of sites with handheld GPS, stills photography, audio-visual diaries, and then some spot sampling for things like dating, wood species determination, growth patterns, and also some targeted excavation just to give us a sense of what was present below the sediment. Because obviously when you're looking across these sites and finding these sites, we're never sure quite what's present in total. So it just gave us a sense of that. This and subsequent seasons resulted in the catalogue of around about 128 individual sites and features. However, because these are dynamic environments, things are being uncovered, and recovered on a regular basis, which means that it's likely that if we went back to the same location year after year, we would see new things appear and lose things we had previously seen.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Love hearing from you guys. Right,
I think
my
infatuation
this week is from a gentleman. Oh, thanks on that.
Perfect. So if we went back year after year, we'd see new things appear and lose things that we'd previously seen. Amongst these sites was a collection of fishing structures that appear on the edge of the western bank of the main channel at low tide. So you can just see them. Can you all see my mouse there? And maybe can you give me a thumbs up if you can see?
Yeah, I can see it, Rob.
Yeah, so there's just round here, this is the Ball and Rock fish weirs, shown in red there. And this complex of sites is named after Ball and Rock, a visible outcrop, which today sits on the eastern bank of the main deeper channel. Now it's almost completely covered by sediment. So what you're seeing in this image is the top of the rock, but actually, although the water's up here, if it even dropped a little bit, you start to see the sediment. So it's really just poking above the sediment on the east bank of the main channel today. From the air, the Ball and Rock fish weir complex can be seen. It's big enough. So I hope you can just see, hopefully on your screens, this V shape in the water. So hopefully it's not too small. And then just emerging out of the channel is the big one. So this is Ball and Rock 1. And you can just with the eye of faith see another arm appearing on the edge of the water. And if the water was to drop by a little bit more, you'd start to see a whole rake of them appearing along the edge of the water line here. So the Ball and Rock complex comprises of around about 25 fishing structures and dates to between about 1250 and 1450 AD. Most are medium to large V-shaped dead weirs. So these are designed to catch fish on a falling tide. Today they are completely submerged at high tide and visible for a maximum of about 3 to 3.5 hours, I suppose, on the best tides. The ends of the trap closest to the current channel are only exposed for around 15 minutes before the tide starts coming back in again. So you have very little time to look at those very extreme parts of the structures. Getting to the site requires a boat, obviously, and we take the boat from Clare Castle, that you saw on the map at the beginning, and it takes around about 30 minutes or so to get there, give or take. And we're also restricted to days in the year where we get sufficient tidal range and duration to even make the trip worthwhile. So this can be 3 or 4 days in a month of the best months. We also work with local boatman called Flan Considine, who knew the water since he was young and was essential in making sure we got to the site safely and crucially left site on time. Getting totally into the archaeology while we were on site, there was a danger we'd be left there as the tide rose. But Flan was very good at cutting through our enthusiasm and getting us off site in a safe manner and getting back home safely. As you head up the channel, you get a real sense of the depth of the estuarine deposits. And there are parts of the journey where all you can see are mud flats and water. And you can really get a sense of it here. So here's the water. And you've got a real mounding of the sediments on the side there and these deep intercut channels that cut through because of the falling tide. Like all good archaeological field projects, you need someone firmly in charge of pointing. Fortunately, we had in Aidan someone who had years of professional pointing experience, and he provided the research impetus for the exploitation of this environment, expanding upon his early examination of the Shannon. Mary Dillon was in charge of the day-to-day investigation across the early seasons, and Conor McDermott lent his expertise from years of working in wetland environments. And this first phase really focused on general rapid characterization of the sites. So just getting a sense of scale, general location, and so forth, using quite traditional methods. And we also sought advice from other experts who dealt with similar structures elsewhere in Europe. The Brittany and Normandy coast providing many examples. So we went to see colleagues in France, and they came to see us. having mini conferences in both locations and site visits. Now, I have to say, we definitely got the better end of the deal. We got to visit Mont Saint-Michel with extraordinary buildings, wonderful scenery, gorgeous food, and we gave our French colleagues a concrete campus in Dublin. But I thought it was a fair exchange anyway. But what we did do was to take them to the Fergus Estuary. And really, it's great having other people come and visit your sites and just having a good discussion about things, because their fresh perspective and experience was really invaluable. To give just one example of something we would have missed, or certainly until we got our eyes in, we were missing, are ghost posts, as we call them. And these could be the result of deliberate removal, and it may be indicating that there's some deliberate removal of posts during the maintenance of these sites. Essentially what happens is that a hole gets left, which is differentially packed with denser material, such as shell, which then gets compacted so that when softer surrounding sediment erodes, it's left standing proud. And you can see it, hopefully, in this image here. These aren't wooden posts. They're effectively the shells and compacted material that have fallen into, it's like an inverted post hole, effectively. So these are left standing proud. And what happens when you start to plot where these are, you can see in red here and here. So these black dots are the bigger extant posts of the bigger structures, but you're just getting a suspicion that there's a third and a fourth trap further to the east of the main traps as you start to plot these. Ongoing repair and replacement was clearly part of the biographies of these sites. This is seen in multiple lines of posts that speak to different phases of maintenance. And you also see surrounding the traps the remains of fallen upper parts of the original structure. So here on one arm of Ball and Rock 1, you can see these multiple posts. And then next to these, you can see the fallen wattlework hurdles that would have effectively formed the sides of the trap when it was in use. Our trip to France also allowed us to see similar structures that are still in use. And it really brought home the scale of some of these constructions. We're able to observe details of the structure above ground level. And for example, further away from the working end of the trap, there's a loose weave of branches that effectively is creating a disturbance in the water, that's what's funneling the fish and encouraging them to keep swimming towards the basket with the closed end. And again, visiting working traps also reminded us that these structures are practically and socially entangled. For example, if I remember correctly, the larger uprights are replaced on around about a 3-year cycle, while the smaller branches along the arms get replaced more frequently. The main point here is that these structures require ongoing maintenance and engagement. They don't just exist, they have to be maintained. On the French examples, the uprights are taken out and replaced with the assistance of machinery. Whereas on the Fergus traps, while we might be seeing some post extraction, most regularly the older posts were simply left in place. Socially, again, if I remember correctly, the French fish weirs have joint ownership, with different people and groups responsible for maintaining different parts, and the catch is divided up accordingly. So these are socially constructed things as well as just practical structures. If anybody's so inclined, you can do your own little survey of the French coast. So this is a Google image along the Britain fish traps. I hope you can see these darker lines just underneath the water in the Google images. In case you can't, I'll just highlight them. So here we are, these V-shaped traps. There's loads of them. So if you go and have a look, it's a good exercise. And I believe that the legislation has changed. So those people that are currently fishing those traps, it doesn't get extended beyond those families, as far as I understand. Now, one of the challenges of the archaeology on the Fergus is that any archaeological excavation or recording is limited to when the traps are exposed. The initial recording of the first phase of assessment was okay to get a general sense of location and scale. However, to capture the detail of these structures, assess change over time, or consistently record things like sample location, we'd need better approaches. Better approaches meant more equipment, and with a half-an-hour journey there and back, and only a 3-hour window to work with, forgetting something was not an option, or at least not an option without a considerable number of expletives. For the next phase, we collaborated with the Discovery Programme in Dublin to have a go at laser scanning the largest sites. We also increasingly use survey-grade GPS with real-time correction. There were issues and challenges with the terrestrial laser scanning, and while it produced some valuable results, it was not something that added significantly to the record relative to the effort involved. Of course, as technology continues to rapidly develop, and if we were going back today, we might revisit this and other methods as equipment gets lighter and easier to use. The most valuable technology was probably the use of survey-grade GPS with real-time correction. By 2010, we had correction via mobile internet available that made the need for a fixed base station redundant. So this method was quick, efficient, and didn't require stable ground. So we were able to do post by post recording of all the traps along the side of the channel. In 2011, Aoife Daly, a professional dendrochronologist and now associate professor at the University of Copenhagen, secured a Marie Curie IEF fellowship at UCD, with me acting as mentor. The project focused on seeing whether we could learn more from the tree ring sequences held within the fish traps. The challenge was that many of the timbers used were very young, so we had no hope of tight chronological control, but nevertheless, they might reveal some insights about internal constructional sequences and possibly the nature of the woodland from which the structure was derived. As part of the process, we also had really valuable support from an expert steering committee of dendrochronologists, Andre Billenbos, Anne Crone, Vincent Bernard, who also came out to visit the site, as Anne mentioned earlier. And of course, we should not forget the extraordinary photogenic and beautiful people in the other boat. Over several trips, we collected 550 samples from the two largest traps, Ball and Rock 1 and Ball and Rock 2 for the project. Each sample was numbered, bagged, and its location identified using real-time survey-grade GPS, good to around about 1 centimetre in XY and 2 centimetres in elevation. These were then transported back to UCD for measurement. Aoife was more used to the satisfaction of long ring sequence, definitive dates, and the possibility of provenance in timber sources at a European scale. So these short sequences, or seagulls as they came to be known, not necessarily affectionately, provided considerable challenges for her. However, despite small numbers of rings in each sample, Aoife was able to distinguish relative chronological groups and tease apart some phases of construction, repair and replacement, significantly contributing to our understanding of the complexity of these structures. Age ranges suggested use of more marginal woodland that was not formally managed, and the mix of species used also reflected a less formal or perhaps not so prescribed choices of resource. Traps like these can be large. The east arm of the Ball and Rock 1 survives to 84 metres, and the western arm survives to around about 65 metres. An individual trap of this scale can therefore require a reasonable quantity of wood resource. Our current estimate is that a single iteration of the trap could use as many as 500 uprights, on top of which we would have to add all of the wood used in the weave. And it's also clear that the structure would have required regular repair and replacement. So there's ongoing demand. Of course, this also has social implications and requires considerable and regular coordination of effort. It's possible that fish traps on the Fergus were under the control of local religious orders. For example, the Augustinian Abbey on Cannon Island is the most likely candidate. It's founded in the 12th century, continued in use across the time the complex was in use, was located on the estuary and was the closest foundation to the site. So here's the Abbey down on Cannon Island, and here are the fish traps further up the channel. Now, one of the things that I thought would be useful for this group is that the exposure of the traps and other features on the estuary is a consequence of long-term periodic processes. Daily tidal forces, storms, and channel migration all play their part, which along with climate change lead to exposure. The traps we are currently seeing may only be available for examination for a comparatively short period of time. and it seems likely we've already lost many examples and that more may appear over time. We can see changes every time we visit, and sites are clearly being eroded away. Here we see the ends of one of the traps. This one's photographed in 2008, and here we are in 2011. And it's clear that it's biting into the traps, and we're losing certainly the upper parts as the channel changes. The loss is perhaps most clearly seen in delicate objects like this eel trap, which probably have comparatively short window within which they can be observed. So again, here we can see one in the trap in 2010, and it's probably almost complete. We're just seeing the top of it here. By 2012, 2 years later, it's effectively been sectioned in half. So there's quite considerable movement across the site. One thing I thought was useful to try at least was assessing change at least over the recent past. And so I started to look at historic mapping to see if it gave us any insight into why certain things were appearing now for us to see. And one of the ways of doing this is to look back at these historic maps. So this one here is one of the earliest maps of the estuary, or at least the early decent one, made in 1771 by John Cowan. It shows a high standard of recording, in particular because access to Clare Castle, which is where we get the boats from, was important, and these charts they pay particular attention to the channel, with depth sounding marked at low tide. So it's important they're reasonably correct. Navigational features like ball and rock are noted, and here it's clearly shown on the west bank of the channel, and not as it is today on the east bank. Note also that the name incorporates the Irish for rock, which is carrig, so effectively it's saying rock, bone and rock. What we have here, you can just see there, is on the west bank, and where we see it today is on the east bank. Perhaps the first really detailed and accurate survey was by the Admiralty in 1840. But note that both this and the Cowan map show additional islands to the north, which I'll come back to in a minute. Again, the emphasis for this chart is on assessing the channels for navigability. Note that on this map, Ball and Rock is mid-channel at low tide, with the water flowing both sides of the rock, not just one side. There is also a slow change in the spelling of the original name as it becomes anglicised. The Admiralty map in particular has additional information such as more soundings. And one thing I attempted to do is to see whether I could combine legacy data, so the data on the map, with our current data. So by digitizing the soundings, it was possible to create a profile across the estuary as it was in 1840. And this can be very crudely compared with our understanding of the location and particularly the elevation of the fish weirs. This is probably not entirely accurate based on a number of assumptions, but it's clear that in 1840, what we are seeing now would have been well hidden from view. So this is the 1840 profile based upon this line on the Admiralty map. And here's a rough location of the channel. There's an exaggeration in the Y scale there. So it's hidden by quite a considerable, possibly quite a considerable depth of sediment. By taking the various maps that were available and plotting them up, and what's nice about this is that you could use the Ball and Rock as a kind of a guide for how these would fit together. You can get a very rough estimate of the change over time. So the red dotted line here is the Cowan map. Then we have the next one over is the Admiralty. Then I've taken the 6-inch Cassini map from the late 19th, early 20th century. And then of course the fish traps themselves mark the edge of the current traps. So we're seeing a progression over time as the channel migrates, and the channel is eating into the archaeology, and presumably it's still going to some extent. This change is sufficiently dramatic, I suppose, to underline it, that if you're travelling up to Clare Castle in 1770, Ball and Rock would appear on your left, whereas now it appears on your right. As part of the CAA project with IFA, we experimented with wiggle matching using multiple radiocarbon determinations from single samples in an attempt to improve our chronological assessment of the two largest traps a little. This clearly gave a more refined range and reinforced the impression that successive constructions were occurring in an east to west direction. This implied that if channel migration continues, we'll see progressively later traps uncovered. So Ball and Rock 2 here is earlier, and Ball and Rock 1 is later. So this is made first, this is made second, and the progression of traps is going this way, and the uncovering is coming this way. What is perhaps interesting here is that the current exposure and movement of channels is from east to west, and seems to be uncovering more and more recent structures. However, the replacement sequence at the time would seem to suggest that they were built, as they were built, they were chasing a channel that itself was moving west from their current location. We can talk about more, but this in the chat is a little confusing perhaps. Now, importantly, the estuary is a dynamic landscape, and both natural changes and those brought about by people have an impact. For example, land reclamation since the Admiralty survey has effectively landlocked some islands and reduced the size of the estuary. It has also probably altered the flow and the direction of the river, and this may be one reason why the traps we see today are being exposed. So you can see here, when I drop out some of the lower contours, as I've done here, that the islands suddenly pop out from their current landlocked status. So you've got one here, one here, one here, and one here. When the traps were in operation, there were probably more channels in the estuary passing around the islands in a similar fashion to the ones we see further south today. So here's islands further south, and we have channels coming up through them, and we might imagine channels coming up in different ways around these islands as well. So today we see the traps emerging neatly positioned on a channel, but this was not the channel they originally operated on. Climate change will also have an impact on sea level, and we're already seeing increasing occurrence of high magnitude events that are destroying sites and features very quickly in this kind of environment. So it's a dynamic, changing environment that we have no hope of saving the structures. So it's important to think about that, I suppose. So I've got some closing points, some things to think about, maybe discuss. We can't save these things as such. And importantly, at any point in time, we only ever see a small snapshot of what's there. So recording over time is the only way to see the bigger picture in one view. And of course, in order to do that, you need time, but funding tends to focus on short bursts of maybe 1 to 5 years. Funding also tends to require something new and shiny, and there's less appetite for continuing to do the same thing, but over prolonged periods of time. Consequently, there's perhaps limited support or infrastructure for sustained, really long-term monitoring. Now, obviously, there's technological innovations that will help. So drones are an obvious example of what we might try. But this is not cost neutral or time neutral. There's a number of things to think about. Anyway, those are my closing points. And just before I finish up, there's a few thank yous. So obviously, Aidan O'Sullivan, Mary Dillon, Aoife Daly, Conor McDermott. This is very much a team thing. Anne Crone, Vincent Bernard, Cyril Billard, Andre Billenbaus, and Congela Maguire, the Heritage Officer for County Clare at the time, Flan Considine and family, the Kelly family, Rob Shaw and Gary Devlin of the Discovery Programme, and of course funders as well and support. So UCD School of Archaeology, the Heritage Council, European Union Marie Curie Actions FP7, and the Irish Research Council Ulysses scheme as well. So that's about the right time, Doug. Yeah.